If Easter didn't happen, Christianity collapses. Not weakens, not struggles, collapses. That's the claim. But here's the problem. The one event everything depends on is also the least reliable part of the entire story. The details don't match, the evidence is thin, and the more you look at it, the harder it is to hold together. Most people feel that and stop right there. But what happens if you don't? What happens if you follow that doubt all the way through? Let's start with the one thing Christianity openly admits, the one thing that has to be true. Christianity is surprisingly honest about one thing. It does not hide where its strength comes from. It openly admits that everything stands on a single event. Not the teachings, not the miracles, not even the moral system people admire, the resurrection. That alone should make you pause. Most belief systems spread their weight across many ideas like a table with several legs. Christianity places everything on one point and says, this is enough. Even the Apostle, Paul the Apostle, says it directly. If the resurrection did not happen, faith is useless. Not weaker, not incomplete, useless. That is a risky statement to build a worldview on. It leaves no room for symbolic interpretation or partial truth. It is either fully true or it falls apart. Think about how unusual that is. You can question parts of most religions and still remain inside them. You can doubt rituals, reinterpret stories, adjust meanings. Here, you cannot. If this one event fails, the entire structure quietly gives way. It is like building a house on a single pillar and then insisting it can handle anything. No cracks, no movement, no pressure, just absolute certainty. And for many people, that certainty feels comforting, clean, simple. It removes the need to constantly question. But that comfort comes with a hidden cost. It trains you not to look too closely at the pillar itself, not because people are dishonest, but because they were taught it cannot break. When something is presented as unquestionable, the mind learns to move around it instead of through it. And that leads to the uncomfortable question most people avoid. What if the one thing that has to be true is also the one thing that cannot hold the weight placed on it? The story that doesn't stay still. You would expect something this important to be consistent. Clear, precise, almost impossible to misunderstand. If one event decides the truth of an entire religion, it should read like a fixed point, not something that shifts depending on who tells it. Instead, the resurrection story feels strangely unstable. Not in the big claim itself, everyone agrees something extraordinary happened, but in the details. And details are where reality usually lives. Start with a simple question. Who actually went to the tomb? In one account, it is a small group of women. In another, fewer are named. In another, the list changes again. It is not a huge contradiction on its own, but it is not clean either. Then the stone. Was it already rolled away when they arrived? Or did it move later? You get different impressions depending on which version you follow. And then come the figures at the tomb. One angel, two angels, or in some cases, no immediate mention at all until later in the scene. That is not just a missing detail, that is the kind of thing people usually remember clearly. Even the timing shifts. Some accounts describe early morning, others say it was still dark. It sounds small, but when you stack these differences together, they start forming a pattern. Not of precision, but of variation. Now, to be fair, small inconsistencies happen in real memories. People recall events differently, that is normal. But here is the tension. This is not an ordinary memory being passed around a dinner table. This is the central miracle of Christianity, the one event that everything depends on. You would expect this story to be guarded carefully, repeated with clarity, preserved with almost obsessive accuracy. Instead, it behaves like something that has been retold, reshaped, and slightly adjusted along the way. And that creates a quiet but serious problem. If the foundation cannot stay still, it becomes harder to trust what is built on top of it. The silence you're not supposed to notice. Now here is something most people never stop to question. If someone truly rose from the dead, you would expect that moment to leave a mark everywhere. Not just in a few stories, but across history itself. Think about what that claim really means. A man publicly executed under Roman authority returns to life. That is not a small local event. That is something that should ripple outward. You would expect witnesses beyond his followers, public appearances, reactions from officials, records, debates, maybe even panic. Instead, what do we actually see? The appearances stay within a very small circle: followers, close companions, people who already believed in him or were emotionally connected to him. The same group that had the most to lose from his death suddenly becomes the group that sees him again. There is no clear record of him appearing before Roman authorities, no documented confrontation with those who sentenced him, no neutral observer stepping in and saying, "I saw this, and I have no reason to believe it." That absence is not loud, but it is noticeable once you look for it. It is a bit like announcing the biggest event in history, and only sharing it with your closest friends. No press, no outsiders, no critics allowed in the room. And when something stays inside a closed circle, it becomes much harder to test. History tends to trust events that leave traces across different sources, especially from people who disagree with each other. That is how strong claims survive scrutiny. They show up in places that did not intend to support them. Here, that kind of confirmation is missing. That does not automatically mean the story is false, but it changes its weight. It moves from something publicly grounded to something internally sustained. And once a claim relies mostly on those who already believe it, it becomes much more fragile than it first appears. The psychology of seeing what you need to see. Let's step away from religion for a moment and look at something more familiar. People see things that are not there more often than we like to admit. Not in a dramatic, movie-like way, but in quiet, convincing moments that feel completely real. Grief can do that. Loss can do that. Even hope can do that. There are modern cases, well documented, where people clearly see or hear loved ones who have died. They speak to them, feel their presence, sometimes even hold conversations. These are not people trying to deceive anyone. They are not confused or unstable. They are responding to something their mind is generating in response to pain. The brain does not handle sudden loss well. When something central to your life disappears, it tries to close the gap. It tries to restore what was there. And sometimes, it does that by creating experiences that feel just as real as anything else. Now, place yourself in that earlier moment in history. A leader is executed publicly. The person you believed in, followed, trusted, is suddenly gone, not peacefully, but violently. Everything you thought was about to happen collapses in a single day. That kind of shock does not just disappear. It searches for resolution. And then the reports begin. Someone says they saw him, another says he appeared to them, another insists he is not gone. These are not wild claims shouted into the void. They are shared within a group already connected by belief and loss. This does not require a deliberate lie. It requires something far more human. The need to make sense of what just happened. The need to believe that the story did not end in failure. Once that idea takes hold, it does not stay contained. It spreads through conversations, reinforced by trust, strengthened by repetition. Each new account makes the previous one feel more solid. And before long, what began as a deeply human response to loss starts to feel like something much bigger, something certain, something unquestionable. How stories grow without anyone noticing. Here is where things start to feel uncomfortable in a different way. The Gospels were not written immediately after the events they describe. They appeared decades later, after the original moment had already passed through many conversations, retellings, and interpretations. That is a long time in human storytelling. Memory is not a recording device. It does not store events exactly as they happened. It reshapes them, smooths them, sometimes fills in gaps without asking permission. You have probably seen this in small ways. Someone tells a story about something that happened years ago, and each time it is told, it becomes sharper, more dramatic, more meaningful. Not because the person is lying, but because they are telling the version that feels most complete. It is like that familiar game where a message passes from one person to another. By the time it reaches the end, the original sentence has changed into something almost unrecognizable. Not through deception, but through repetition and interpretation. People remember what stands out, what matters to them, what fits the larger story they believe they are part of. Now apply that to something much bigger. a movement forming around a powerful belief. Stories being shared in small groups, repeated in gatherings, shaped by teachers trying to explain what it all meant. Over time, certain details become more important. Others fade away. Some are clarified, others are adjusted to make the story flow. Stories do not just survive in that process. They grow. They become more structured, more compelling, more aligned with the message they are meant to carry. And that is where meaning begins to influence memory. Because meaning is not neutral, it pushes stories in a direction. It sharpens the parts that support the message and softens the parts that do not. And without anyone deciding to change anything, the story slowly becomes something more than what it started as. Not necessarily false, but no longer untouched by the process of being told again and again. The detail that should have made it stronger, but didn't. Believers often return to one point as if it settles everything. The tomb was empty. That detail is presented as the turning key, the moment where doubt should disappear. But look at it closely. An empty tomb does not explain itself. It does not carry meaning on its own. It simply presents a situation and asks a question. What happened here? And once you ask that question, possibilities start appearing. Was the body moved by someone? Was it taken? Was the location mistaken? Was there confusion about which tomb was being visited? These are not wild ideas invented much later. Even in early accounts, alternative explanations were already being discussed. That is important. It shows that from the beginning, people were trying to interpret the same event in different ways. Not everyone saw it as proof of resurrection. Some saw it as something else entirely. And here is where the tension grows. None of those alternative explanations require anything supernatural. They rely on human actions, misunderstandings, or simple errors. They may not be satisfying, but they are possible within ordinary experience. That is what makes this detail more fragile than it first appears. It sounds strong at first. An empty tomb feels like a clear signal. But the moment you examine it, it opens into uncertainty rather than closing it. Strong evidence usually narrows possibilities. It points clearly in one direction and reduces the number of reasonable alternatives. This does the opposite. It creates space for multiple explanations to exist side by side. So instead of resolving the story, it introduces a gap, and gaps are powerful. They invite interpretation. They allow belief to step in and complete the picture in different ways. Which means the detail that should have made everything clearer ends up doing something else entirely. It leaves the story open. Why this story had to exist. Now we get to the part most people overlook, not because it is hidden, but because it feels uncomfortable to consider. Early movements do not survive on ideas alone. They need a turning point, a moment that transforms failure into something meaningful. Without Easter, what do you really have? A teacher who gathered followers, challenged authority, and was executed. That story was not unique in that time. History was full of similar figures. They appeared, inspired small groups, and when they were killed, their movements slowly disappeared. The energy collapsed because the outcome made the message look defeated. That is the pattern you would expect. But something different happened here. The story did not end with death. It reversed it. Instead of defeat, it became victory. Instead of failure, it became fulfillment. And that shift changes everything, not just emotionally, but structurally. A movement built on a tragic ending struggles to grow. A movement built on triumph has direction. It has purpose. It has a reason to continue. And here is where the deeper insight sits. This does not depend on proving the event in a strict historical sense. It depends on what the story does to the people who believe it. It transforms despair into certainty. It replaces confusion with clarity. It turns a broken moment into the beginning of something larger. Movements do not run on facts alone. They run on meaning, and meaning needs a catalyst. It needs a moment that people can point to and say, this is where everything changed. Victory over death is the strongest version of that moment you can have. It does not just solve a problem, it removes the final limit. It tells followers that nothing can ultimately stop what they believe in. And once a story carries that kind of power, it does not fade easily. It grows, it spreads, and it becomes something people are willing to build their lives around. The quiet fear beneath the surface. Here's the part people rarely say out loud. Questioning Easter does not feel dangerous in an intellectual sense. It feels dangerous on a much deeper level. Emotionally. Because once you start asking serious questions about it, a second question appears almost immediately. If this does not hold, then what does? That is not a small thought you can casually entertain and move on from. It touches everything at once. Years of belief are tied into it. Personal identity is tied into it. Family connections, traditions, shared rituals, even a sense of belonging. It is not just a story sitting in the background. It is a structure people have built their lives inside, piece by piece, often without realizing how central it has become. So when doubt shows up, it does not feel like curiosity. It feels like risk. Pulling on one thread can feel like you might loosen the entire fabric, and most people do not want to find out what happens if it comes apart. Not because they are avoiding truth, but because they are protecting stability. That is why the question often stays quiet. It appears for a moment, usually in a private thought, then it gets pushed aside, not answered, just postponed. It joins a collection of other unresolved thoughts that sit in the background, waiting for a time that never quite comes. People tell themselves they will think about it later, when life is calmer, when they have more time, when it feels safer. But later has a way of stretching out indefinitely. And over time, the question does not disappear. It just becomes quieter, buried under routine, belief, and habit. Which means the tension is still there, just below the surface, waiting for the moment someone decides to finally look at it directly. But here is the truth most people slowly discover. Doubt is not a weakness. It is often the first honest step toward clarity. If something is true, it does not need protection. It does not need to be handled carefully or shielded from questions. It can survive being examined from every angle. And Easter, for all its importance, carries a weight that invites scrutiny. The more central a claim is, the more it should hold up under pressure. This does not force you into a conclusion. It does not tell you exactly what to believe, but it does shift how you approach the question. Because when the strongest claim rests on something that becomes less stable the closer you look, that matters. And the discomfort people feel is not random. It comes from sensing that the answers are not as solid as they were first presented.